Okay. Good afternoon to everyone who have joined us for this webinar on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, RCEP. My name is Yok Ling. I'm from Third World Network, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I'm very pleased that we have with us, two excellent speakers with tremendous experience, and also panelists of activists from industry, who are also from members of parliament who've been elected representatives, and those who have been very involved in research and organizing with unions, as well as small businesses. So we have a very diverse panel who will respond to the main speeches from our two main speakers. So I'd like to welcome all of you once again. We see that we have actually quite a number of participants from the region. I do apologize that we are not able to have any other languages for this one, and it's going to be in English. I just want to start, if Rachita, you can just show the two slides as some background. Many of you are familiar with this, but just to recap, and for those who may not have some of the background, the RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, was initially an ASEAN initiative. The negotiations were launched in 2012, and the countries involved, you can see in the list here: Australia, Brunei, Darussalam, all the ASEAN countries, China, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Republic of Korea, and of course, we have India. This was a very significant initiative with a lot of hopes back in the day. However, as we all know, in early November in 2019, India actually, after doing their own internal analysis of the impact of RCEP on the national economy and different sectors within the country, decided to actually withdraw from RCEP. Of course, around the region, there have been a lot of different organizations, civil society, farmers, unions, patient groups, small businesses, which have actually expressed concern over the years. Now, RCEP at the moment is scheduled to be signed on the 14th of November, which is this week. The countries, what they will actually open up or not open up, have actually been going on during the pandemic. As we know, the text is not available. What we do know, the discussions and analysis have been based on leaked chapters, only like 2 or 3 chapters. And so this has been a big problem, the lack of transparency and access to the text. Even though the text is ready to be signed, it is still not available and will be released, and there's a link here, once the countries are signed. Just a quick context, WHO has already said at the beginning that the pandemic will take 4 to 5 years, very conservatively, to get under control. The World Bank says the economic recovery that has been the fallout, major fallout from the pandemic, may take 5 years. And again, very conservative figures. So we are talking about really, this agreement is going to be signed, and if it does come into force with enough countries to ratify the next legal step, then it is going to be functioning in a condition that was not foreseen when it started in 2012. Next slide, please, very quickly. Just to show you, when we talk about the RCEP agreement, what is involved. You can see there are 20 chapters, and this agreement, like the more recent comprehensive Trans-Pacific agreement as well, are very, very all-encompassing in terms of the different sectors, the different parts of the economy, across horizontally, and also from the big companies, the national institution, all the way to the small farmers and the small producers. So this is very all-encompassing, and this is why the impact of any of these agreements is tremendous on society, and we need very, very careful analysis. So I'll just stop here this was just to give a bit of quick background. Yeah. So I have great pleasure to introduce you to our first segment of our discussion, where we will have Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundram, who is associated with the Columbia University currently, and he was formerly the UN Assistant Secretary General dealing with economic and social affairs. Has done, many of you know him very well. He has done a lot of writing, research, and helped governments at the individual national level as well as the UN on many, many policy issues. So Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundram is going to give us setting the scene on the big picture to introduce us into the agreement. And then Dr. Rashmi Banga, who is a Senior Economic Affairs Officer from UNCTAD, who has done many, many years of really, really groundbreaking work, taking the numbers, helping policymakers to look at many issues ranging from trade in goods and market access to electronic commerce and a whole range of issues related to economic development. So we've asked Dr. Rashmi Banga to share with us what is the analysis of the trade in goods or market access, which is one of the most promoted benefits of trade agreements like RCEP. So the two of them will be speaking, after which we will have a short, maybe 10 minutes for a quick question and answer, because Dr. Jomo has another commitment and will have to leave us after an hour. So without any further ado, Dr. Jomo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yok Ling, for the invitation, and also it's a pleasure to see many old friends as well as new friends on this medium. I'm very glad that we are able to reject social distancing while embracing the need for physical distancing in these difficult times. Let me try to set the stage by stepping back a little bit, because many activists face a number of problems in dealing with many of the issues involved. Firstly, it's often asserted that free trade is obviously a no-brainer. You know, freer trade will always be beneficial to everybody concerned, and so on and so forth. I think it's very important to recognize that even some of the major gurus of all this, people like Paul Krugman, as well as Jeff Sachs and others, are now have now recently at least distanced themselves from this kind of simplistic position. Now, their motives are very complex, and I won't get into that right now, but I think it's very important to recognize that there is no consensus as far as so-called trade theory is concerned and the need for free trade liberalization. Also, historically, especially those of us who are from ex-colonies, know very well how this was, how free trade was always very, very selectively applied. So, for example, the period from the middle of the 19th century was often known as the imperialism of free trade. And even gurus of free trade liberalization, people like Jagdish Bhagwati, for example, concede that anything less than multilateral, inclusive multilateral free trade liberalization involving everybody is really suboptimal. He refers to them as termites, okay, which gives you an idea of how even the biggest champions of free trade, such as Bhagwati, for example, have actually distanced themselves from many of these things which are called free trade agreements. So it's very important to recognize also that developing countries, especially, and many different developing countries, and even developed countries are quite different. So for a small country like New Zealand, for example, the conditions are very different from India, for instance, or in turn for a relatively small country like Timor-Leste. So I think we really need to begin to think very seriously about the variety of conditions, because very often the variety of these conditions is a stumbling block to greater solidarity and cooperation. We have to recognize that we live in a very variegated world, and that it is important for us to recognize the different challenges which we all face, and the need for solidarity, even when they do not when particular measures do not necessarily threaten us very directly. Now, another factor to consider as far as free trade agreements are concerned is that very often they don't involve trade. For example, if you look at the arguments for something else related, which is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which of course Trump killed, but very possibly Biden and company will revive, perhaps in amended form. What is important for us to see is that the supposed gains which the World Bank and the Peterson Institute and other champions of the TPP acknowledge is that most of the gains are supposed to come from additional investment. So it's not the trade clauses which are important. It is really the investment clauses, and very related to this, and this is why I appreciate the participation of lawyers here, is the whole question of property rights. And property rights are a very, very disputed area, but unfortunately, very often we find that they are not challenged sufficiently in this situation. Let me just mention two which are very, very important in your own considerations. One, of course, the intellectual property rights, and we can see right now in the face of COVID-19 how intellectual property rights have become a very, very major stumbling block. Third World Network and many other campaigning groups have recognized that how intellectual property rights and the desire to extend intellectual property rights further with less and less exceptions is hugely problematic. And of course, related to that, relating to so-called property rights, and you can see it has very little to do with property, but it's the question of investor-state dispute settlement issues. This is another area which has become very important. And I think the irony, of course, is that the pretext which was advanced by the Trump administration for why they refused to support the TPP was precisely because of intellectual property rights. Because what happened was that for the first time, they recognized that they were going to lose a case on the basis of the ISDS provisions of NAFTA. Just to recall very, very quickly, NAFTA allows all the members to sue, and the US had never lost, of course, in many of these cases. But then there was a real possibility of losing because it was Obama who the pipeline agreement involving a company called TransCanada, and they knew that they were going to lose, and this was the motivation for basically objecting to ISDS. Now, the new administration in Washington from the end of January may have a very different, is likely to have a different view of, and we are going to see a very change of the American stance as far as many of these things are concerned. So we should be prepared for this. Now, two other factors which affect our thinking very much, as Yok Leng has correctly emphasized, is the whole question of what happens with COVID-19. COVID-19, the disruption due to COVID-19 is due to several factors, of course. One, of course, the very fact of contagion from COVID-19. But related to that, of course, is the actions taken by governments. Okay, if you look at many East Asian governments, Japan, Taiwan province, Korea, China, Vietnam, Laos, and so on, you do not have either significant contagion. Contagion has been largely contained, but very importantly, they have been contained without the need for lockdowns. So we see that what has happened in places, in many other places, India and many other parts of the world, we see that the lockdowns have become very important means by which authoritarian governments are able to exercise their will under the pretext of public health. So it's very important for us to recognize that that many of the economic disruptions which have happened precisely because of government measures which have been taken by governments in response to contagion. It was not something which was inevitable, and we could have avoided a lot of the disruption which has taken place if we had taken the necessary measures. But very importantly, also, we have seen how the pointing of fingers has resulted in, for example, the US and the Abe administration in Japan taking measures to discourage their own companies from investing in China. And since so many economies are now very integrated into the Chinese economy, we have seen very, very significant disruptions in many parts of the world because of this attempt to isolate China, which will probably be exacerbated by the revival of the TPP, whether it's called the CPTPP or some other form. The other very important development is that there are very, very few champions of the WTO, of multilateral trade liberalization. If they are serious about trade liberalization, there would be important measures. But you can see that Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has been blocked from becoming the new Director General. And so what you see, and this might change, of course, with the new administration, but what you see is a very struggles to block the functioning of multilateral trade liberalization. So the commitment of many of these governments to trade liberalization is really disputed is really undermined by their very actions. Now, two other elements to consider, one other element to consider, of course, besides the disruption of the WTO and the undermining of the WTO in the recent period, of course, is the fact that I think if we are serious about trade, and there are very important trade issues to be dealt with, especially in these difficult times, supply chains are being disrupted. Many relatively open economies, such as my own country, Malaysia, are facing very, very major disruptions. But these disruptions have also opened up the opportunity for us to begin to rethink about how you can reconfigure the world and develop new capacities in our own economies, much more consistent with sustainable development objectives, which and of course much more egalitarian objectives. So I think these are some of the issues which we might want to think about. I know that I'm running out of time, so let me stop here. But thank you very much again for this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Jomo. Perfect timing. In fact, you've given a couple of extra minutes for us to squeeze into some questions towards the end of this first part. So Rashmi, with pleasure, please share with us your analysis of the trade in goods aspect of the RCEP particularly.
Thank you, Yokling, and thank you for inviting me to this very important discussion. I'm going to share today some of the results of my forthcoming paper. Distinguished participants, next slide please. As we all know that we are living in times of multiple crises. It is not just the health crisis, it's going to lead to a big economic and financial crisis along with the climate change crisis. So I don't think just by washing our hands regularly, we are going to overcome these crises. The role of the governments become extremely important at these times. Next slide. We have recently launched a trade and development report, and the report predicts a K-shaped recovery for the global economy, where the wealthy will experience a V-shaped recovery, and it is going to be a struggle for the rest. And as we know, developing countries have more number of poor people living in them. They are more vulnerable. So they will be hit harder and they will take more time to recover. If you just compare the rescue measures given by the developed countries, they are something like 30% of their GDP, while in developing countries, they don't even reach 5% of GDP. So in this context, Trade and Development report calls for the need for policy and fiscal space. And as Jomo just mentioned, it is very important. COVID-19 has given us a second chance to rethink the way we are looking at the globalization. It's no longer free trade liberalization which is going to help. It has to be strategic globalization. And the role of governments become extremely important in this case. So if you look at just tariff liberalization, many countries say tariffs are not important source of revenue, but tariffs not only provide additional revenues for the government, but they also help the governments to regulate import of luxury items, especially at the times of crisis. So this is a very important policy tools in the hands of the governments, which is simple, effective, and easy to use. Next slide. Now, if you look at the FTAs, what does a developing country look at FTA, or what is the rationale for a developing country to enter an FTA? Increased market access in partner countries is an obvious reason for an FTA for a developing country. Cheaper imports of items which are not domestically produced, but again, the tariffs can be put down to zero in this case. Cheaper imports of inputs for production. Again, unilaterally, you can put down the tariffs to zero for the inputs. But tariffs also helps, in forming regional value chains. So regional trade agreements become important for regional value chains. They also give more stability in trade policies and encourage foreign direct investments, yes, but then FDI is also encouraged. There are many additional factors which encourage or which attract FDIs, not just the tariffs, because we no longer have tariff jumping FDI, very, very little tariff jumping FDI is there. So trade and FDI should be looked at as not an end objectives in itself, but as means to achieve development. So if you enter an FTA, it's not just that just trade and FDI as such will increase. We have to also see that what kind of trade is increasing and what kind of FDI is coming in. Will that help the countries to develop more or to attain their sustainable development goals? Now, coming to the existing FTAs between the RCEP partner countries, you see that already all countries have entered into FTAs or are negotiating FTAs among themselves. So if there has to be any additional market access amongst the RCEP member countries, it will come only if there is further tariff liberalization. We all know that already countries have liberalized 80 to 90% of their tariff lines. So if you are looking at RCEP, for additional market access, that would imply that more liberalization needs to be done for any additional market access. Next slide. So what I'm going to share with you is the results of smart simulation. This is a methodology which has been developed by World Bank and UNCTAD. It is available in World Integrated Trade Solutions. In this methodology, what we look at is that if all tariffs of all countries are put down to zero, what will be the increase in imports and exports, country-wise, product-wise, and it gives you 6-digit HS code level results. Now, this is kind of a maximum possible scenario. So what is the maximum gains that you can hope to achieve under RCEP? This is what this will give, and every country, the methodology provides at HS 6-digit level, what will be the imports from which country, what will be the exports to which country. So I think this is an analysis which all governments should undertake. Also in terms of developing your sensitive list, this can be a very useful analysis. So let me share the results of RCEP with all of you. Before I come to the results, very quickly, when I was doing a literature review, I did not see, at least to the best of my knowledge, any study which is adopting or which has applied this smart simulations at HS 6-digit level to see what will be the implications or economic impact of RCEP. Most of the studies use CG models, and as we know, CG models are black boxes. You can just change assumptions, then with the same data and the same models, you get different results. They also use very unrealistic assumptions. They assume perfect competition. We know in the age of digital, with Amazons and Google, we cannot really assume away monopolies. They assume full employment of labor and capital everywhere in the world. Interestingly, they assume that government budgets will always remain balanced. That means if tariff go down and government revenues go down, then governments can always make up or compensate their budgets by raising internal taxes. Now, there is a recent study by Boston University which shows that this happens only in developed countries. In developing countries, government lose their tariff revenue after tariff liberalization forever. They are never able to recover that revenue. Also, a very important assumption of CG model is that all products are unique. That means you cannot have oil and rice produced in one country substituted by oil and rice produced by another country. And we know how untrue that or how unrealistic that assumption is. Next slide. So coming to the smart simulation, what is the maximum market access post RCEP that can come? The results show that maximum increase in exports, for all countries, if you add up, is something like $70 billion. And the way, if you look at who gains from this total increase in exports post RCEP, you find that China, Japan, Korea are the maximum gain. So between these 4 non-ASEAN countries, Japan, China, Korea, and Australia, almost 88% of market access is gone. Next slide. In terms of imports, you find they are much more diversified. Imports increase in almost all countries, and especially in the ASEAN countries. So I will share with you what imports will increase from which countries. Next slide. Now, if you look at the change in exports, the ASEAN countries will, the exports in ASEAN countries, total exports I'm talking about now here, RCEP, I'm not including India in this. These are the existing RCEP partners. So exports of RCEP, of ASEAN countries rise by $5 billion, of non-ASEAN countries increase by $62.7 billion. Imports in ASEAN countries increased by $22.4 billion. And imports of non-ASEAN countries increased by $49 billion. So balance of trade of ASEAN countries worsen after RCEP, post RCEP. So the ASEAN countries will lose something like $17.3 billion per annum post RCEP if all countries liberalize. So this is the maximum case scenario. And the non-ASEAN countries trade balance improves by $12.7 billion. Now, next slide. Now, if you go country-wise, This is how the scenario, the simulation results, this is what the results we arrive at. All ASEAN countries, if you look at imports, the imports rise for all ASEAN countries. Even for like for Cambodia, it rises by $4.4 billion, Indonesia $1.3 billion, Malaysia $7.3 billion, Philippines almost $1 billion. Singapore, the tariffs are already zero, so no imports increase in Singapore. Thailand and Vietnam, $3.4 billion and $4.3 billion. Imports also rise for China, Japan, Korea, and Australia, but Australia, the import increase is very marginal. Next slide. If you look at exports, you find that exports of some of the ASEAN countries actually go down. Now, why does this happen? This will happen because when in the ASEAN trade agreement, when new countries enter, then the tariff or let's say the preferential access which the member countries have, they lose that preferential access, and the production and exports are restructured towards more efficient producers and more efficient exporters. So in this case, Cambodia's exports post RCEP will actually decline by $75 million. Indonesia's will decline by almost $1 billion. Malaysia's by $133 million. Philippines by just $4 million, but Thailand will exports decline by $3.3 billion. So this is every year exports will decline by for ASEAN countries because there are more efficient exporters in the group with preferential access now, like China, like Japan, like Korea. Exports of Japan increases the most. So Japan gains the most from RCEP. It's $26.6 billion, China $24 billion, and Korea $8 billion. Next slide. So if you look at, next slide please. If you look at balance of trade, no, previous slide, sorry. So if you look at balance of trade, you find that Cambodia's balance of trade will worsen by $4.5 billion, Indonesia $377 million, Malaysia $7.5 billion. So Vietnam $4.2 billion. So ASEAN countries are not going to be gainers from RCEP, but non-ASEAN countries like Australia is going to gain $2.9 billion, Japan $6.7 billion. So ASEAN countries really need to rethink whether this RCEP is going to give them the additional market access and help their economy, especially at the time of crisis when the domestic financial resources are really needed. Next slide. Now coming to, next slide please. Now coming to where do the imports come from? So if you look at Cambodia, 2.3 billion will be imported from China, 300 million from Japan, 141 million from Korea. So most of the imports into the ASEAN countries are coming from China. Malaysia will import 3 billion from China. This methodology also gives you at 6-digit level what products are going to come and by how much. I will also come to that. Now, how does the export change? Next slide. So if you look at change in exports, then you find that exports to China are actually becoming negative because China will start importing from other RCEP countries like Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. In many cases, Japan and Korea are more efficient producers of certain products as compared to the ASEAN countries. So exports to China actually decline. You might think China is a big importer, so there can be additional market access into China because of RCEP, but the results really do not show that. Exports of Korea, if you look at Korea's exports, it increases to China, Japan, New Zealand. China's exports increase massively into Japan and Korea. So this is the kind of restructuring that will take place in the existing trade and existing exports within the ASEAN countries. Next slide. Now, what are the top 10 imports of ASEAN countries post RCEP? Country-wise, you find that most of the imports are going to be for Cambodia of fabrics, motor cars, that will be in the textile and clothing sector, and motor vehicles, also footwear. For Brunei, it will be footwear, seats, mattresses, furniture, lamps and lighting. Next slide. For Indonesia, motor cars, agricultural products, bicycles, again textile and clothing and agricultural products. For Lao, it will be the import surge will be of motor vehicles, again textile and fabrics. You find some rice, there will be an increase in rice as well. So post RCEP, these are the kind of import surges that will take place in these countries in terms of the sectors. Next slide. In Malaysia, the imports, so I'm giving you imports at the 4-digit level, but imports are also available at the 6-digit level. Imports will be mainly of motor vehicles, motor cars. So I'm giving you the top 10 imports. Electric apparatus, some electricals, and also rubber and other adhesives. For Philippines, motor cars, motor vehicles, some agricultural products like onions, etc., rice. Next slide. For Thailand, again, milk and cream, dairy products, agricultural products, motor vehicles, articles of jewelry. For Vietnam, textile and clothing, footwear, motor vehicles, electrical apparatus. Next slide. So these are broadly, but the results are also available at 6-digit level. I'm just sharing some slides of some countries' top 5 or 10 products. But if there are some policymakers in the room, please be in touch with me. I can share all the 6-digit level results that I have from this methodology, country-wise, product-wise at 6-digit level. Next slide. So these are the kind of results that are generated. So you know exactly how much imports can come from which country at of what 6-digit level product. So you can be more specific in terms of understanding what import surges will be and in which sectors and from where. Next slide. Just to give you an example, if you go down to 6-digit level, so it will be cane or beet sugar, 170114 from Thailand. From China, it will be bicycles and other cycles. Textile clothing, women or girls blouses, this is 610620 from China, and imports will be 66 million into Indonesia post RCEP. Next slide. So overall, I would like to again say that we are in this digital era. All countries are looking at how to digitally industrialize, how to add digital content in their production. It becomes very important that your existing trade competitiveness is maintained and increased, and for that you will need policy space. We know that all RCEP members are also members of WTO, and as Jomo mentioned, that it is very important to liberalize multilaterally rather than to have free trade liberalization, which is not the way to go forward at this time. It is strategic globalization which is needed. In the WTO, we have in MC12, there is going to be discussion on the moratorium on electronic transmissions, where governments have agreed to put tariffs to 0 for all electronically transmitted, all electronic transmissions. We know data and software are heart and brain of digital revolution, and they're both electronically transmitted. If we put down, if we agree not to have any tariffs on electronic transmissions in future, it will become very difficult for the governments to have digital industrial policies. We find that in the near future, you're going to have digital technologies which all use data and software. Like 3D printers, a foreign firm can just install a 3D printer, import software duty free, and then start 3D printing many of the manufactured products. So all negotiated tariffs in WTO as well as all the GATS flexibilities become meaningless in that scenario. So again, it is very important. I know electronic commerce chapter, we do not know what it is going to be in RCEP. it may not be enforceable, but it is very important that in the WTO, the countries keep their policy space and also their fiscal space. Because, next slide, if you look at the currently electronic transmission, they include movies, music, video games, and they're all luxury items. And in the times of COVID-19, government need more finances to look at their domestic industrializations, to revive their SMEs, to revive their trade sectors. There is a paper by Untitled which shows that this can be a growing, steady source of revenue for the governments if they do away with the moratorium and start putting custom duties on electronic transmissions. Developing countries can generate something like $10 billion per annum. Next slide. So the broad conclusions which emerges from the study is that it is very important for countries to preserve their policy as well as their fiscal space to deal with COVID-19 pandemic, because this is going to lead to economic crisis as well as you already have climate change crisis, and government's role become very important, and it becomes very important for the governments to have sources of revenue. Now, FTAs like RCEP may further restrict policy and fiscal space. The smart simulations show that, especially for ASEAN countries, post RCEP, there will be a rise in imports, which will be more than their rise in their exports, which will worsen their balance of trade with respect to the RCEP members. Every year, ASEAN countries may start losing more money in terms of because of the adverse balance of trade. Imports of luxury and unproductive items are going to increase, like motor vehicles, defense equipment, etc. There will also be increase in imports of textiles and clothing, and as well as agricultural sector and dairy products. And we know these are sectors where unskilled employment is very high. And if tariffs on electronic transmissions are put to zero, then the government will have an additional source of revenue, which is going to increase substantially in future, because we know more and more products are being digitalized. Again, in the end, I would like to say that policy space for digital industrialization will be severely limited, because we know that market access is not the only issue in RCEP. There are many other chapters which can have legal implications and further restrict the policy space of the governments. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashmi. I think that was really helpful. And just to remind, because we do have in the room several negotiators and also policymakers from governments who have really been very interested in this topic. So I'm sure you can help them with more detailed country level information as well. We have also posted Dr. Banga's email into the chat box for those who are interested to contact her. Right, we will have about maybe 10-15 minutes where questions and maybe comments and clarifications can be submitted to both Rashmi and Jomo. There's already a question actually in the Q&A box, Rashmi. Is it possible or probable that some of the import surge is in intermediaries that can be used in production in ASEAN countries? That's one of the questions to you. Would you like to answer that first?
Okay, this gives you imports of all products that will happen. It will give you at 6-digit level imports. And what we find is that, the tariffs on inputs are already put down to zero by many ASEAN countries. We all know we need inputs, so the tariffs are already down to zero. Now, if at the 6-digit level, if you go down and you see only further liberalization of tariffs can lead to additional market access. And now when you say further liberalization, you are cutting into your sensitive list. And when you cut into your sensitive list, these are mainly the finished products that are there in the sensitive list. So overall, I would say if further liberalization takes place because of RCEP, it will eat into your tariffs of finished products more than the tariffs of inputs, because unilaterally also you can put down the tariffs to zero of inputs, which you need for your production.
Thank you. There's another question, whether your calculations include the impact of non-trade barriers, such as standards, and if not, will then the exports from ASEAN countries be even lower if we cannot meet the standards of the richer countries?
Very true. The data does not capture non-tariff barriers. These are just tariff liberalization, and we all know that there are non-tariff barriers in the advanced countries, and exports will definitely be further limited.
Thank you. Yes, are there other questions or comments to both Rashmi and Jomo from the participants? Please feel free. Anything else you would like to add yourself, Rashmi and Jomo? We do have a few minutes. I think we have some questions coming in too now, sorry. Right, there is a question to Rashmi. Can gains from services sector forego losses in the goods sector for ASEAN countries?
Now, again, the study that I have done is for the goods sector. For services sectors, I think we all know that there are some NTVs, there are some, some problems in terms of increasing access in services sector. Let me not go into the details of that, but what I have presented is just market access in the goods sector, but services liberalization is a different issue. And as far as, if you do the analysis, or if you look into the other chapters of RCEP, you will find that the policy space in terms of services liberalization is further limited because of other chapters, not just the market access chapter.
Thank you for actually pointing that out, because I think this is one of the challenges of these kind of agreements like CPTPP and RCEP, is because each chapter has to be assessed on its own terms in terms of policy space impact. And then if you want to see whether we can trade off and get benefits in other chapters, it's a very different exercise. And that's why a very comprehensive assessment is actually needed with a lot of information and better assumptions than we have had so far. All right, there's one more question. How far do FTAs, especially RCEP, will increase the values of FDI to ASEAN countries? Because some countries will use RCEP as an opportunity to attract more investment to come to the countries, as well as to use the country as a production hub for boosting export values to third countries.
Like I mentioned in the presentation also, that when you want to attract FDI, tariff liberalization is not the only factor that comes into play. There are many factors which attract FDI, and tariff jumping FDI has become less and less in recent times. The foreign firms need much more than just tariff liberalization or cheap, even cheap labor is no longer attractive to foreign firms. And because of digitalization, it is other factors like, do you have data centers or what kind of data localization policy you have? Now, it might be, I just want to give you an example, like Indonesia has a data localization policy and it is attracting many foreign firms. More FDI is going into Indonesia because the data centers are being shifted by the big tech firms from Singapore into Indonesia so that they can bring the data into Indonesia to process. Again, here I would like to share that, there are many data center incentives given by US states, like free electricity, like tax rebates, just to attract more FDI into their states. So even within states, there is a lot of competition to get foreign for FDI. So FDI now, when you look at FDI, it's not just tariff liberalization or cheap labor or market. So these were the traditional factors that were attracting FDI. Now the factors are very different. So in terms of getting FDI so that you can get, there are other ways than getting into a FTA like RCEP.
Right. So we're also having to really modernize our thinking about FDI and be more sophisticated. Right. There's another question. Do the results of your study include existing liberalization commitments from ASEAN +1 FTAs, or do they just represent the additional liberalization from RCEP on top of existing FTAs?
Thanks for that question, because this gives me I can share a little more on the methodology. The applied rates are used. So effective applied rates, which mean so all FTAs are taken into account. So already existing tariffs in the country vis-a-vis other countries. So if ASEAN member already have an FTA, then their tariffs are zero. So the existing FTAs are taken into consideration while doing this simulation. So it is very important because in methodologies like CG modeling, what happens is that they have broad sectors. So in those kind of models, it is very difficult to see what is the existing liberalization but within the member states. But here, in 2020, Australia has, the year used by in this simulation is 2019. So if in 2020, if some countries have further reduced their tariffs to zero for ASEAN member states, so that liberalization is not taken into account. But till 2019, whatever is the existing tariffs vis-a-vis each other between the partner RCEP partner countries, they have all been taken into account.
Right. I mean, this is something that I think we've been so looking at, many of us, that already ASEAN has trade agreements with New Zealand and Australia, where the bound tariff is zero on all lines. Yeah. So in that sense, what is the gain? If we wanted to enter into Australia and New Zealand markets for ASEAN, then this is no added value, really.
Yeah, of course. So that is what I'm saying, that that is the reason the results come out this way. You don't find exports rising as much as imports, because ASEAN countries have their sensitive lists. They still have compared to the advanced countries, they still have tariffs in some of their sensitive products. But in advanced countries, and let's say Singapore, you see the results show zero increase in imports in Singapore, because already the tariffs are down to zero. So what is the additional, I think it's very important for policymakers to think, what is the additional market access that they're going to get? Is this, what is the additional, they already have existing FTAs and they need to protect their sensitive sectors. Even in RCEP, they will need to protect their sensitive sectors. So what is it, how is the sensitive sectors going to change? They are not going to change. If they're not going to change, then any additional market access will come only if you cut into your sensitive list. Now, can you afford to cut into your sensitive list? I think that is the type of thinking that is needed.
Right. Very important point for us to take back home. There's another question, Rashmi. Could you provide some details about whether there's any impact on access to medicines and related products?
I can share with you at 6-digit level all the products where import-export will take place country-wise, from where the imports will come and how much the imports will come. Right now, I don't think I have that. I cannot recall that kind of results, but definitely I can share these results with whoever is interested.
Because it goes to quite detailed products. Right. Yes. Thank you very much. I see. Do we have other questions? If you want to speak, just get to your name, and you can also raise your hand if you want to say something, the participants, or you can continue typing as others have done.
Also, I want to add, if this is one thing, if you think some medicines are important or some inputs are important, you can unilaterally, put the tariffs down to zero. You don't need to sign an agreement or bind yourself to put the tariffs down to zero. That policy space is what we are talking about. You can put them down to zero, but tomorrow, if you don't want those products coming in and you want to build your own sectors which are producing inputs, which you were importing earlier, you can then raise the tariffs on the inputs and give some protection to your own domestic industry, which is coming up in terms of providing inputs for your production.
Right, so you're really strongly advising we keep our policy choices to use tariffs as a very flexible tool. Right. Okay, there are two questions which I will put to both Rashmi and Jomo. The first one from Susanna saying, Prof. Sundram explained that the theoretical by academic support for trade liberalization is fading. And Rashmi, you've shown that the economic benefits, at least in trade in goods, are limited. So are ASEAN countries signing on RCEP based on geopolitical considerations? A question for both of you. And also another question, how far do you think this RCEP will promote the engagement of ASEAN member states to the regional supply chain through FDI? Maybe both of you could respond to these two questions. Jomo, you want to go first, Jomo? Yes, you may have to leave us in a few minutes.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Basically, I think there's very little, the basic problem is that we are rather beholden to thinking which has come from which has not really placed national interests foremost. And the problem has been worsened by the fact that most of the cheerleaders of trade liberalization are very, very influential. They get the media and so on and so forth. Just to give you an example, in Malaysia, there was recently a study urging not only that Malaysia ratify the CPTPP, but also admit Taiwan into the CPTPP. But what it does not say is that that organization actually received tens of thousands of money from the Taiwanese office here. So you have a lot of campaigning, of lobbying, which is done ostensibly as academic work. And you also find this in a lot of so-called academic work, which is done in these countries. The other problem, which I think is very serious, is that the second administration in Indonesia now, with the omnibus bill, has been has become much more Washington-oriented, if I may put it that way, in terms of its policy thinking. And this poses very serious problems because in the past, particularly in RCEP negotiations, it was Indonesia which was probably seen as more recalcitrant, second only to India. Now with India out of the negotiations, Indonesia basically, and Indonesia sort of making a U-turn, we are going to see a lot more, a significant change in the tenor of the negotiation. So I'm quite concerned that ideologically, even though all the things which have been said by Rashmi and I will be really not terribly consequential because it does not really significantly enter the discussions which are being conducted by the trade negotiations. Very often, behind our backs, they will say, polite things. Yes, she's right, but it doesn't include this, doesn't include that, and so on and so forth. These are the usual ways in which these studies are dismissed. Or there will be they will cite other studies, such as the studies which Rashmi referred to, for example, as far as the TPP is concerned, or the CPTPP. In fact, some of the studies are so absurd that that without the US, the CPTPP was supposed to generate even more growth benefits to the CPTPP members compared to with the US there. I mean, some things which you don't need to be to do any serious modeling. The same model is supposed to have resulted in these different results. So, I think what negotiators have to do is to trust their own instincts in terms of what are these things, and forget about all these claims about, trade theory tells us this and so on and so forth. What really happens is, as Rashmi emphasized, that we have to be very, very pragmatic going forward. Thank you.
Right, and the question that also about whether RCEP can promote engagement of ASEAN member states in the regional supply chain through FDI. Either one of you would like to address that question?
I think I'll address that.
Yes,
see, I showed a slide where I showed that already RCEP member states have existing FTAs among themselves. There is no country in RCEP which does not have an FTA with other countries. So there is no additional FTA which is taking place bilaterally, or so that the FTAs already exist. So FDI had to come, it would have come already because of this. So if you're getting into RCEP thinking that it is going to attract more FDI into your country, then I don't see any logic. Why will it? You already have FTAs with all these countries, then why is it that you think RCEP is going to increase FTI? Now, one argument could be that, you can have rules of origin. Now, we don't know what rules of origin are being negotiated under the RCEP, but it is so difficult to use the rules of origin and to really implement this. And in other regional blocs, we have seen that the implementation is extremely difficult. And also if you start looking at it, how many FTAs, how many countries actually benefit from this rules of origin, you don't find any empirical evidence on that. So something, and now the times are different, like we are getting into multiple crises. We are going to face economic crisis, we are going to face financial crisis, there's going to be climate change crisis. I think government states have to keep a steady source of revenue. The revenue that they will get from their citizens in terms of taxes may become very limited when you have more unemployment in the country. So the sources of revenue are going to shrink, but the expenditures are going to rise because you will also need to revive the economy. And so that's why it is very important to keep policy space and fiscal space, and tariffs gives you that fiscal space. So let's say tomorrow, if you really need revenue, you can bring your tariffs, you can increase your tariffs on motor cars so that you don't have imports of motor cars and you save the domestic financial resources and not spend on motor cars or video games. So these kind of policy space and fiscal space will become very necessary for the governments in near future. Not near future, I would say today, from today itself.
Right, and you were also indicating that there will be a restructuring, a need to restructure within ASEAN, and what we want to do as regional cooperation, just from the trade imbalance that will come if ASEAN moves ahead. So really, it can actually undermine our ASEAN kind of regionalism if we don't play it right.
Definitely, because when more countries enter the ASEAN space, then your preferential access that you have because of this regional FTA, you lose that preferential access, and that access goes to more efficient producers and exporters. And you will find that how many countries in ASEAN can really compete with China in terms of exports and in terms of, so you have to be very pragmatic in terms of your regional integration, and regional value chains are very important. But you have to have very strategic interventions with governments and the industry of ASEAN to initiate these regional value chains. So the regional value chain, just linking into global value chains or just linking into value chain of an advanced country is not going to give you that benefit. You have to upgrade in the value chain, and within ASEAN, I think there is a lot of potential to initiate ASEAN's own value chains and then to export globally. So the regional value chain, the end product can be exported globally, but the value chain within ASEAN countries. But once more countries enter that space, I think then the benefits to the ASEAN members will become limited.
Thank you very much, Rashmi. I think I don't see any more questions or comments at this stage. We will have our panel members will come in and share the perspectives from different angles, and then we'll have some time at the end of the session for also a bigger discussion. So we may have some things that may come back to you. So we hope that you can stay with us to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much. And Jomo, I gather that you have to leave us if he has not already left. So I'd like to thank, at least at this point, both Jomo and Rashmi. And your study is, I think, really, really helpful for all of us at the government and also civil society and unions level. So thank you very much again.
Thank you and all the best.
Thank you, Jomo. Yeah, we'll talk more about the Malaysian side, how we can work together with the government to navigate this impact assessment. Okay, thank you. Right, so I just wanted to, before we move to my inviting our really diverse and very important panelists to share their different perspectives, I just wanted to very quickly share some research that's ongoing by my colleagues in Third World Network, because we were very concerned about many of the measures that have been taken by all our governments to respond to COVID. First, the public health measures. Secondly, because of the economic fallout and the need for economic recovery, to take care of the social protection and all that we've been all very involved in. So how do these measures measure against trade agreements like RCEP or the CPTPP? I mean, for us, we see that countries like Australia that are already a party to the CPTPP, in some of their measures are already violating the CPTPP itself, right? And there you have ISDS, which actually raises a lot of questions. We also seen that some law firms are already advertising, these are the firms that do a lot of ISDS, investor state dispute cases. They are already advertising their services to corporations to say that many of these measures, much as they may be needed, are actually violating many investment and trade agreements. So already the ambulance chasing, for ISDS, it's already going on. We're very happy, of course, due to, I think, a lot of the debate from civil society, trade unions, small businesses in the region. For RCEP, ISDS has been excluded for now. And many of the worst aspects of patent extension, for example, in the CPTPP are not in RCEP, but nevertheless, we need to go through each of the chapters to find out what are the challenges. So what we did in Third World Network, my colleagues did, and we managed to work out until very late last night, that we took a whole bunch of measures from different countries in the RCEP community, and we looked at the lead chapters. Of course, there would have been some changes due to negotiations, so we don't know what the final look of the services, investment, and intellectual property chapters are. And of course, there are also chapters around so many other aspects of like government procurement, etc. So we will need to look at the full text to be able to do a proper assessment. But already by looking at a list of very commonly used measures across the region, examples, for example, closing businesses in certain service sectors. So even countries like Korea, which did not have a big lockdown, had restrictions on quite a number of services. So things like partial reopening in certain sectors, or you have certain economic ministries, like in Malaysia, we have that too. The Ministry of International Trade will decide which are the essential services sectors that will be open, on what conditions. So we are now talking about a lot of maximum policy space being used by our governments, right? Then classification of things like price control, especially on medical products. Trade restrictions, export restrictions was quite common from India to Indonesia to Malaysia on masks and many things, ventilators. Then suspension of mortgage payments. So a lot of issues around services. Nationalizing production in some, in some cases. And then government taking control over hospitals if necessary, etc. So we looked at the whole range of measures, including perhaps the need to deal with debt and also generic versions of masks, medicines, how to step up all the production of the much needed medical products. So we sort of measured that against what we can know already about RCEP, and we see that many of these measures would be potentially in violation. The question on, I think, intellectual property that I think Beverly had asked, although the worst sort of substantive provisions are not there of like patent extension, etc., but the enforcement provisions in RCEP IP chapter are actually more than WTO TRIPS agreement. And so we find that there will be situations where infringement, if proven, can actually make our producers locally pay retail price of those products, right? So this is very actually worrisome. And of course, on top of all that, we now have the South Africa-India proposal in the WTO TRIPS Council asking for a waiver for a certain period of intellectual property implementation and enforcement. This is a growing global call from across all kinds of institutions, UN agencies, human rights rapporteurs and experts, and of course civil society. So really the world has shifted massively, and we really got to make sure that if governments do decide to go ahead and sign on the 14th of November, the RCEP agreement, they have to really go back in there and really do a lot of homework. Are these provisions today still relevant for what we need to do, or are they going to actually provide us with a lot more policy constraints? Because this, as I said in the beginning, we were warned by WHO and the World Bank, this may be a 4 or 5 year kind of adjustment. We are hearing informally, they're talking about 10 years to learn to live with COVID, right? We don't know. So we may also have future pandemics. That is a real issue in the public health discussion. So how do we get ready and not have these agreements constrain us unnecessarily? So on that note, I would like to actually move to the next phase of our discussion. We will also share the research outputs from TWN. We want to work with our partners. We have been discussing this within RCEP among the civil society groups, that we will do a template, and then from there we will all try and fill in from our knowledge of our own national measures, laws and provisions, and to do our research at the national level in all the countries, and so we can help our governments identify what are the measures that are needed, and where and things that they may even need to anticipate in the future, and how do we review actually the RCEP agreement itself. Yeah. So now moving on to the panel, we have with us, like I say, very diverse list of colleagues. I would so we are inviting you to give us maybe around 8 minutes of your feedback, and you can also of course respond to some of the points that have been raised by our speakers earlier on. So the first person I want to invite is actually Barry Coates, who is with Trade for All Advisory Board. He was a member of the Green Party. As a parliamentarian, he was actually holding the portfolio on trade, investment, and commerce, and has been a very seasoned activist, researcher, and thinker on trade agreements and development. So Barry, please, I'd like to hear your views.
Thank you, Yokling, and it's a pleasure to be here and great to see some people who I haven't seen for a very long time. I think I'm talking in my presentation a little bit more from a developed country perspective, a bit more from a New Zealand perspective, and the main message that I have is that things have changed a lot since the start of RCEP negotiations. The negotiations started at a time when the kind of free trade model was still strongly held, and I think what we've seen is not only changes as a result of COVID, but we've actually seen a change in the thinking around the role of government intervention and the role of government regulation. And if we look at agreements like RCEP, they assume that the world is best served by liberalisation agreements that restrict what governments can do by way of regulating the economy. And what we've seen in New Zealand, for example, is a change of government away from a deregulating government to a government that is now putting in place some of the regulations that will help address many of the challenges and crises that we now face. And the world has changed because, as Rashmi's slide showed earlier on, we face crises, not only the coming recession as a result of COVID, but we face an absolutely massive climate crisis, which is going to change the ground rules in every society in the world. And my background is having worked on climate change for about as long as I've worked on trade policy, which goes back a number of decades. And we're continually underestimating the impacts that climate change will have on the structure of economies. And when Rashmi talks about the need for fiscal and policy space for governments, we haven't even started to see the kind of restructuring that is going to have to happen if we're going to address the climate crisis in a way that is completely going to wean first the developed countries and subsequently all countries off reliance on fossil fuels. And that process is not just a free market process. That process will require government intervention and regulation in many different ways. Similarly, in New Zealand, finally governments are starting to step up to the inequality crisis. The fact that in a supposedly rich country, we have massive gaps in social indicators, in cultural indicators, and particularly affecting New Zealand's Indigenous people and people who have migrated to New Zealand from overseas. And these kind of crises are not able to be dealt with within the framework of free trade agreements like RCEP that the government is continuing to negotiate. If we look at what's happening in the business community in New Zealand is moving on. They're talking about sustainability. They're talking about products that consumers can really trust because they have sustainability credentials. They're talking about sustainability in supply chains. They're talking about ways in which businesses can really respond to the demands of consumers for sound environmental performance and sound social performance. So businesses are moving on, governments moving on. As Dr. Jomo said, economists are moving on, but somehow these trade agreements are still stuck in a past where liberalisation, not only of tariffs and direct trade measures, but also of the broader economy, is still the dominant approach. And I first met you, Yokling, when we were trying to fight an agreement called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment in the mid-1990s, and that was a time where investment was being taken into the international negotiations. It was defeated after a battle of citizens, and were able to show that governments hadn't thought about the impacts of deregulation of investment and measures like investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS. But then we saw investment being put into the World Trade Organization. And again, that was fought, and Yokling's former colleague, the late Martin Kaur, was an absolute international leader in providing the intellectual arguments, but also organizing around those battles. And then we saw the emphasis, once it was defeated in the World Trade Organization, we saw investment proposals moving into the TPPA agreement, which was again fought around the world, of course, into free trade agreements, and now investment provisions. We don't know exactly what they are because the agreement is still secret, but they're an RCEP. We see the same kind of issues being raised with e-commerce, where digital agreements are being particularly propelled by the interests of the major digital players, the Facebooks and Amazons and Apples and Netflix and Googles of this world, the so-called FANGs. We see intellectual property rights, again, pushed by pharmaceutical companies. Agreements like the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which were originally pushed in the World Trade Organization, particularly by financial services companies around the world. And we see government procurement that is very much pushed by global interests. And in all of this, we see unacceptable levels of secrecy. And the idea that an international agreement would be signed without prior scrutiny, without proper impact assessment that is undertaken in an objective way should be really unacceptable. As Rashmi said, there's very little to gain for New Zealand from the agreement. We have free trade agreements with the RCEP countries. There was potentially gains in India with regard to an agreement with India if India had stayed in RCEP. But again, that was mainly in terms of major dairy company pushing into dairy markets in India at the costs of the livelihoods of potentially millions of small farmers. So what we see is the fact that now India is no longer part of the agreement. We're not seeing great advantages for New Zealand exporters, and we don't see much difference in terms of the trade. So New Zealand is very much signing on to the agreement, not propelled by economic interests particularly, but primarily because New Zealand wants to be seen as a supporter of free trade. There's been a start of defining a better way. In the fight against the TPPA in New Zealand, we had some massive public protests, and it was one of the biggest protests seen in New Zealand in a generation. And we saw a public opinion poll that said over half the population opposed the TPPA agreement. And a lot of it was around the fact that large multinationals from overseas were being given advantages over democratic processes and over the rights for small companies. So what we're seeing is a start of trade reform in New Zealand. And after the election of a Labour government, a left-wing government, in 2017, we saw the government form a group called the Trade for All Advisory Group. And I was a member of that group. I must say there were a lot of business people around the table and very few civil society groups, but I think we had an influence. The report makes really interesting reading. It talks about trade not being an end in itself. Trade is not a thing that society necessarily wants in terms of its benefit. Trade is seen to be a contribution towards greater well-being, a contribution towards a better society. And I think in the past, the expansion of trade has been seen as an aim in itself, and now that is changing, and it's changed in an official report from this trade advisory group to government.
And we have to wrap up. Sorry, Barry.
Yeah, sorry, Yokeling. I wasn't quite sure of the time we had. Anyway, so let me just say that the Trade for All Advisory Group, the attempt to find a new way of trade models is starting to point to an opportunity for deeper reform, moving away from the failed model represented by RCEP and other trade agreements, towards trade agreements that actually meet the challenges of the future, not the failed models of the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I think I need to send an email. Sorry to the panelists about maybe 8 minutes each. Yeah. So the next person I'd like to invite is actually Ian Sharif, who is from Indonesia, from PT Sipata Moda. It's a textile company, a local company. And I think that looking at Rashmi's numbers, where Indonesia's biggest vulnerability will be such an imports of textiles and garments. So I think your views will be very appreciated. So Ian, over to you. We can't hear you.
Yeah?
Yeah. Okay.
Voice out.
Sorry, no, can't hear you.
It's already very loud. Let me check.
Okay, I think you need to hold the microphone closer. Yeah, to yourself. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, is it clear now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder. So thank you for inviting me to this meeting. It's very interesting. I agree with what all Dr. Rashmi said and what has been shared in regards of RCEP. So our main concerns is with the existing FTA versus RCEP. Existing countries with its own FTA create diversified opportunities among countries. For example, Indonesia do import a lot of raw materials from Indonesia, from Thailand, from China, and from India to produce goods that are re-exported to Korea and Japan. But multilateral agreements such as RCEP will eventually bypass those diversified opportunities and give the most benefit to countries who are best organized to seize opportunities. You can see how centralized governments like China that has the sole focus on industrial efficiency will seize this opportunity on cost and price alone. And we don't see countries like China giving up their trade export rebate policies until today, even after the FTA. China still allow export rebates up to 13 to 16% of HS code up to 50 from 61. This is for textile. And we also have concerns that post RCEP, they will not abolish this trade rebate. They will still exercise this because they do need this trade rebate to balance the prices of their textile export. Without these rebates, actually, the China exports of textile goods are no longer competitive against countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And also our second concern is recently we worked with the government and we have recently applied safeguard duties measures against China. And with RCEP, we are seeing a possible transshipment activities where goods will be shipped to other RCEP participating countries with zero tariffs and eventually re-exported to Indonesia and bypassing the trade remedies that we have put. So we have worked with our governments. We are planning to increase the amount of non-trade barriers. China have 2,500 non-trade barriers, and it has been very difficult for us Indonesian textile manufacturers to export to China. They have this compulsory China certification, and they do a lot of things even after FTAs that make us difficult to export to China. But we have less numbers. We have around 10% of the required amount of trade barriers. So we are increasing those trade barriers. We are verifying importers. We are putting up national standards, and we are doing import pre-testing. And I hope this can shield at least numbers of the negative effect of the RCEP. It seems impossible for us to pull back from this agreement itself. We have tried to talk to governments. With us being in the association, they always ask for our advice in regards of the HS code and what to do with the trades. But the government has been quite close about the RCEP. They are not very much open. But the Ministry of Industry is very much concerned about the impact to our industry, and we have been working with them hand in hand, just how to put more trade barriers and avoid the amount of import floods in the future. Yeah, that's from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I think you've given us a very, very concrete, struggle of what it means in real life. So I will now move to listen to, so you can hear from Mr. Jayan Mehta from India, who has been having a huge struggle with somewhat different results from Indonesia. Please.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the Third World Network and Ranjaji for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll just share my screen and we'll have the small presentation. I hope I'm visible and audible. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'll start with this small incident of the story of the Amul's and India's resistance to RCEP and the power of the postcard. Postcard, as you know, is a 140-year-old tool of communication introduced in India 140 years back, and it costs 50 paise, which is half of Indian rupee, and in $1 you can buy 140 such postcards. And when millions of such postcards were written to the Prime Minister of India by the milk producers of Gujarat and the rest of the country, we realized that it was a fight worth putting up to ensure that India does not enter the RCEP. And I'm talking about the challenge of the Indian dairy industry. As an employee of a cooperative which is owned by 3.6 million farmers, it was our responsibility to take up this case, particularly for the food and the dairy industry of the country. And our plea was to keep dairy out of RCEP because primarily agriculture is very important to our country. It employs more than 60% of India's population and contributes to almost 1/5 of the GDP, and of which dairy is 1/3 of agriculture GDP. This is very important because in the pandemic, it was only agriculture GDP which was positive, and I'll talk about these numbers later. So milk being the largest agricultural crop of India and dairy being a supplementary source of income to more than 100 million families, this was a very, very critical issue for livelihood and survival of a lot of Indian people. Our main challenge was posed by New Zealand in RCEP. Both Australia and New Zealand were keen to export their dairy product surpluses to our country at a cheap and a lower rate. Australia has a population of 4 million. New Zealand has a population of 4 to 5 million people. India is about 1.3 billion. Though India's milk production is higher, the marketable surplus of Australia and New Zealand is actually much, much higher. As a result of which, we were actually, and New Zealand exports 93% of the total milk it produces, whereas India is marginal importer come exporter of products. We are largely self-sufficient. And since we are able to pass on more than 70% share of the consumer's rupee to the producer, we are supposedly quite efficient in terms of providing value for money to the customer and giving the best price to the producer. The challenge in RCEP was not just external, it was a bit internal also. And since there are a lot of people from this sector in this meeting today, one should also be very clear about what data which is used by the government, which is provided by the economists, how true or relevant that data is. In our case, we found a lot of data being incorrect. So we had a big challenge in providing the correct information to our policymakers, to our politicians, to the decision makers, to see that there is actually no case of allowing dairy under RCEP, imports under RCEP, because India is not only self-sufficient in milk, India's milk production is growing. And some of the information, which comparative data, which our economists of the Center for Regional Trade in Government of India provided, they were misleading. And actually the case they built up to allow imports under RCEP from particularly Australia and New Zealand was actually very false and fabricated. And so we did all these things. We had to sensitize the governments, the state, provincial governments, The national governments, the governments from different provinces of the country talked to the civil society members, milk producers across the country, because what was at stake was loss of livelihood for 50 million rural producers in India. It would have led to a drop in farm gate prices by as much as 30, 40, 50%. And this industry would have lost about $40 billion a year. And hence, the case was very strongly built up that the RCEP will be good for only 10,000 rich farmers of Australia and New Zealand at the cost of 100 million poor and marginal milk producers of India. And our expectations from the government since early days were very simple. For the last 5 years, we've been working on this. We were telling the government very clearly that India is the largest producer and consumer of milk in the world. So as Dr. Rashmi Banga pointed out, if you are a producer of a particular product or a commodity, our free trade agreements actually are not worth the while. Okay, milk being the largest agricultural crop in India, India growing at a milk faster rate than the world, and food security and livelihood were the most important concerns. And this is what we continuously brought to the attention of the policymakers and the government. The industry was also quite opposed to it. I mean, there was a RCEP ministerial conference in Hyderabad in 2017, and CI had organized a conference on it. You can see the big names of all the industries of the country, be it the Tatas, the Birlas, the Reliance, everyone actually came together and opposed to it. So we knew very clearly, while they were not voicing it so strongly as we did, they were not very happy with the way in which the RCEP was shaping up way back in 2017. So when in middle of 2019, we realized that India was very strongly pursuing it. Not only we took up the matter, but we also saw that there were nationwide protests across the country, the length and breadth of the country. Farmers were getting united. The civil society was actually up in arms against this. And across different sectors also, we realized that a lot of people, a lot of other industries also trying to build a case to not allow RCEP in the respective commodities. And this is what happened when the state of Gujarat, the province of Gujarat, where we have 3.6 million farmers that we have, almost 1.5 million such postcards were written. And you can see that these are all actual our real milk producers, and they needed support from the government. And this appeared in media also very prominently. And fortunately, on 4th of November, this is what our Prime Minister announced, that our farmers, and obviously he recognized the effort of the farmers, professionals, industry workers. He did have stakes in such decisions. And when he measured the RCEP agreement with the interest of all the Indians, he said he did not get a positive answer. And he invoked the talisman of Mahatma Gandhi, the father of our nation, and his own conscience, and said that it does not permit him to join the RCEP. This indeed was a big news for the country and for the milk producers, and we definitely reciprocated it by putting out an Amul hoarding, a topical billboard, which said the firm PM and a farm PM. And now we realize a year later that how this economic impact of pandemic would have affected badly the decision of our joining RCEP. And India also realized that we need to move more strongly on the self-reliance story. So the Prime Minister announced what is called an Atmanirbhar strategy, which is India's self-reliance strategy in May, and in his independence speech on 15th August. And he was very clearly said that we need to be vocal for local and make Indian brands strong in the global market. So all said and done, all what we have been advocating for last so many years actually has been translated into the reality and the government policies now. And look at the GDP. I mean, like most countries, developed and developing, India's the GDP did fall by 15-25% in the quarter, which was the worst affected by the lockdowns and the pandemic. Okay, but the chances are that GDP will recover. But the good news comes only from agriculture. And despite all the lockdowns and the breakdowns, you can see the agriculture in India, the GDP continued to grow by about 3.5-4%. Whereas the industry, services all dropped by, industry dropped by about 40%, services dropped by more than 20%. But it was agriculture which kept the whole Indian economy flag flying. In fact, we at Amul handled 20% more milk than the previous year during this period of lockdown. So that's where the agriculture and the dairy delivered. Rural wages also increased in the period of lockdown. The government's policy of creating jobs also helped in supporting the producers in the rural areas. And the disparity between urban and rural, actually, you can see the rural folks were much better off, and the urban people had decline in jobs because of the pandemic. So all said and done, we also looked at other aspects of inflation. in which milk products inflation actually cooled down. A lot of other inflation cooled down because more supply was coming in the market. The market was a bit affected. But point to be noted here is that inflation to consumer is income to the producer. And this is what we as farmers cooperative always advocate and tell the government, that we need to look after both ends of the spectrum. Good part about the pandemic and the last few months is Indian rupee appreciated against the US dollar and most other developing country currencies. And the exports to China also, the gap between India and import and export, the trade has actually reduced, but still there is a very, very large gap which needs to be filled up. Looking at the gains which other countries are expecting out of RCEP, China also is now talking about a self-reliance strategy. Atmanirbharta in English is self-reliance, and the latest policy unveiled on 29th of October, they are also talking about self-reliance. In one of the key things which China imports is technology. So the benefits of RCEP are actually not real, and in the uncertain times ahead, things will be very difficult. But in India, it's not that one door closed. They have multiple opportunities also coming up. This is the time when people are looking at changes in their manufacturing bases. India becomes a very preferred source of destination for sourcing their manufacturing the products and also sourcing their products from India. And a recent study which has come up from the Standard Chartered Trade Opportunity Report, there is a huge about $20 billion opportunity for Indian exports to also increase to other developed countries. Half of these countries are in the 10 countries which they studied are Asean members, in which India has already a free trade agreement. So actually things will look up better in the coming days. So as I mentioned earlier, India is likely to be one of the main beneficiaries of the supply chain diversification as organizations seek to spread the risk in the wake of the COVID disruption. India's self-reliance strategy is sure to pay a good dividend, and livelihood will continue to be a very key factor for India's free trade agreement strategy. Not only we talked about RCEP, but USA deal also was under negotiation. EU has been taken up again. India is talking to UK also. India is talking to Australia, New Zealand also. So all these things, strategy, livelihood will continue to be a key factor, because there are millions of milk producers, millions of farmers who need support from the government and for the efforts they are putting in this. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thanks once again for the invitation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jan Mehta. I think it's very encouraging in these moments of despair with COVID and everything to really hear your story about how the cooperative and the farmers and the whole impact on the national policy discussion has been so promising. And I think one of the things that we've always said is that within our region and even with the developed countries markets, we can always have all kinds of much more targeted deals and agreements rather than these kind of comprehensive, cumbersome ones. So we'll move on to the last two speakers on the panel. We have Kate Lapin, who is very known to many of us in the area of women's rights. She was for many years regional coordinator of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, and now is the regional secretary for Public Services International for Asia and the Pacific. So we'll be hearing from Kate on the public services sector. Please, Kate.
Great, thanks, Jocelyne. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for a really impressive panel so far. I think the research that's been presented by UNCTAD, but also by Dr. Chomo, is really going to be a valuable tool for trade unions. A quick mention of PSI. We are the global union federation that represents workers who deliver public services. And for quite some time, PSI has been involved with work to oppose trade agreements that constrain public policy space, have a negative impact on workers, and erode democracy. And I think the RCEP is an illustration of what potentially could happen across the region. Although, of course, as has been mentioned, it's not quite as deep in its impact as the TPP, it is still deeply concerning for us and for our members across the region. So for us, we've been working to oppose these kind of trade agreements, both because of the impact on workers, but for our interest is also in public services. And it's really interesting to see the impact that's been presented by UNCTAD on the trading goods, but also, of course, we know that the RCEP does a lot more. It constrains public policy space. It increases the pressure on governments to privatise because, of course, public services end up having to be traded and compete with multinational players who deliver public services. But it also has a really negative impact on inequality, and I think Jomo's presentation indicated that a lot of economists are increasingly recognising that these rules really do shift the economy and the weight of who has power in the economy towards multinational corporations and away from workers, but also other forms of inequality. And as Jacqueline mentioned, I have a particular interest in the way that these trade agreements have impacted on women. And I really see that a range of chapters in these agreements and in RCEP as well have a really corrosive impact on gender equality. And one thing I think is really worth noting is that although in many cases we would, as you know, our members across the region and particularly in India have a lot of concerns about the current approach to trade unions and workers. In India, we do appreciate that at least that the government had some was receptive to these kind of concerns of workers, as was mentioned, of smaller cooperatives, and also of the interests of women producers. And that was one thing that I remember, as was mentioned about the Hyderabad demonstrations that the government responded to, was around the procurement chapter, and mentioning that they had heard the demonstrations, they had heard that women had real concerns about the capacity of government to use their policy space to procure from, say, small women's cooperatives or other sort of pro-local procurement. I think that this has been a very interesting elaboration of what the major dangers are. One area I think we really have to think about is, why is it that governments are giving up this policy space? There are so much in these trade agreements, and as we know, we don't have the full text and yet to fully understand the impact on policy space. But the only conclusion I think we can make is that the multinational corporations now have far greater influence on governments than the public does. And that is a real concern for us, because we know every piece of research that we have across the countries, whether they be developed or developing, shows that the public actually wants countries to invest in public services. But governments are prepared to give up that capacity to the interests of foreign multinationals, even when they don't have those multinationals as domiciled in their own countries. So whilst, you know, I guess you can understand why the New Zealand government wanted to promote dairy. Okay, it's not in the global interests, but it might be in their domestic interests. It's really difficult to understand why governments are going out there and batting for multinationals that they don't even have domiciled in their own countries, that don't pay taxes, that aren't contributing to the public good. So, for example, we don't yet know with the RCEP how extensive the data rules will be, how the digital trade rules will be, or e-commerce as they call them. But we know that governments are promoting those rules and have been promoting those rules through the negotiations, and there will be something, perhaps not as deep and as extensive as the TPP, but that they will be there. And the countries that are doing that are not necessarily those that have big tech domiciled in their country. So big tech is mainly, of course, in the US and China, maybe Korea, but for example, Australia and New Zealand have really promoted this chapter. And so I think what we can say about the RCEP is that it fundamentally undermines democracy, and all of the trade agreements are fundamentally undermining democracy. It undermines democracy because they're not transparent, because workers and the community don't have a say, because members of parliament who are not, necessarily in the trade ministry also don't know, but also that they constrain future governments. And I think what they are doing is constraining the potential for future pro-Labor, and by that I mean future pro-worker governments to come in and be able to alter the economic rules. And that's a huge concern, of course, in the current climate with COVID, as was mentioned, that these rules have been demonstrated to really constrain the capacity of governments to respond to public crisis, whether it be a health crisis, an environmental crisis, an economic crisis, a crisis of inequality. We know that governments are no longer able to do that unless they are willing to breach trade rules. And as Jocelyn mentioned, we already have evidence of that happening. And COVID has shown us that governments often do need to control the supply chain, even for commercially produced goods. They need to intervene when, for example, care has been or public health has been unable to respond to the situation. In some countries, aged care has been taken over where it's been commercialised. In some countries, airlines have been taken over where a country wants to retain that capacity. But of course, we also know that a lot of other public services that have failed in the past, future governments have wanted to intervene and make sure that they are available for the public interest. And so I really do have to question the motivation of governments who are signing on, particularly now. It's always a question, but particularly now, in the midst of a pandemic. Why would governments want to sign over their own policy-making space? And all we can conclude is that governments want to deregulate for their friends and regulate their enemies. So they deregulate for big corporations. They guarantee them as much policy-making power as they need, but they regulate those groups that they don't want to support, and that includes trade unions. I think it was mentioned earlier, examples like in Indonesia, the omnibus law, or in India, of course, there's been recent reduction in labour laws. And this is, I think, this is unfortunately happening across the region, that governments are regulating unions and deregulating multinational interests. What we actually need now, and I guess just in closing, is really to think about what would it take for solidarity. That was mentioned earlier, I think by Jomo, is that now is the time to look at what would governments actually do if they came together, if they looked at what kind of policy making is required across the region or across the world that would advance the public interest. In a time of COVID, I certainly reinforce the comment that Jocelyn made about the need to address intellectual property and have a waiver so that we can ensure that all kind of inputs, whether it be a vaccine or other types of inputs for COVID, can be accessed by all. But we would also want to look at things like, how can we better collaborate on tax? Trade agreements have been a real constraint on governments to be able to collect taxes. It's one of the largest areas of investor-state disputes is their capacity to collect taxes from multinationals. And we know that governments need more revenue. So that's where they could collaborate rather than constrain themselves. We know that governments actually, rather than a race to the bottom on wages, could come together and say, let's actually collaborate and say that nobody will undermine a standard for minimum wage. These are all parts of the social contract that governments agreed to, almost a century ago, when they said that they would collaborate more closely to protect human rights. So I think that's what we need at the moment. I really do appreciate the analysis that UNCTAD has done, because I think that gives us weight to further campaigning. At PSI, we also are trying to do further work with our affiliates to make sure we can have all of the arguments to help combat these trade agreements. Most recently, we've done a fair bit of work on the digital trade rules, but I think this work that UNCTAD's contributed will be very valuable for us. So yeah, thanks to UNCTAD, but also to all of the organisers of this panel. I think it's something that we'll take forward in our continued campaign.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think Susanna has just pasted on the chat box. There will be a press conference. The unions are getting together on trade justice and RCEP. So please, you can get more details from the chat box. So thank you very much, Kate. And now I have great pleasure to invite Ms. Jang Hye-yong from Korea. She's from she's a member of the National Assembly. And I thought it would be nice to end our panel discussion with the voice of a member of an elected legislature. And Korea has been also a place where these issues have been very contested. So please, Ms. Yang, over to you.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for giving me this precious opportunity to speak with you all. And my name is Hye-yong Jang Hye-yong, and I am the member of the National Assembly in South Korea, and I'm from Justice Party. And actually, I'm working in the Strategy and Finance Committee. So actually, the field of international commerce treaties are not my specialty. But nevertheless, today I will do my best because I feel how important it is. So I would like to participate in this urgent discussion for raising the questions and expressing my worries of the transparency problem of the RCEP negotiation procedure today. So today, South Korean newspaper said such an economy of the size of 1/3 of the world population will be born through RCEP in a quite positive tone. However, the article doesn't say anything about the real content of the treaty. So compared to the big social argument and discussion regarding Korean and US FTA around 2012, it is really too silent and really strangely silent. So in South Korea, there is an act on the procedure for concluding commerce treaties and the implementation that took effect in 2013. So this act prescribes matters related to the procedures and implementation of trade treaties. The main purpose of the act is to enhance the transparency of the negotiation process and understanding and the participation of the people about the content. However, the current process of the negotiating RCEP by the Korean government seems to be quite inconsistent with the procedures specified in this act. For example, in the case of information of the conclusion of commerce treaties, basically, it is not possible to refuse to disclose information just because the negotiation are in process. Though there are a few exceptions, basically it is. However, until now, the Korean government has not disclosed any information other than the chapter names, only the chapter names. By the act, also, when government rejects the request of information disclosure, the government must state the reason and the method, but they also didn't do anything, didn't give any information why they refused the disclosure. The government just kept saying, just because negotiation is in process, so they cannot give any information. So when important matters are in the act, important matters in the plan for concluding a trade treaty are changed, the government shall immediately report the details of the change to the relevant standing committee of the National Assembly, but also they didn't. For example, when the India left the treaty, it is very important change of this RCEP treaty, but they supposed to report this change to the National Assembly, but they didn't. So I think this might be the violation of the act about, And on the other hand, considering that there's a total 5 ASEAN and Korean FTAs, the total number of the chapter is only 5, but the RCEP has the total of 20 chapters and contains great deal of new contents, like, as you mentioned before, intellectual property rights in e-commerce and competence and government procurement and etc. So, however, just really little information about what these chapter contains is known to the public. So there is no public discussions in, of course, civil society and even in our National Assembly. It is too much. It's too silent. So the Trade Treaty Act that I mentioned before ensures that any citizen can submit opinion on trade negotiations or treaties to the government. However, no one could get a chance to read to the enough information about the RCEP, so no one could express their opinions or deals with their gain and losing. And so me and party members or other party members of my party think regards this is a serious problem. And although those procedures for consenting to ratification by the National Assembly remains, there's no case, sadly, in which our National Assembly has not ratified the treaty signed by the government so far in Korea. So for this reason, the discussion on ratification in the National Assembly will have considerable limitations. So this is really our concern. And if the content of the RCEP includes the toxic clauses that many of you have spoken about today, it will cost such a huge social discussion, and really it will cost a lot. So I would like to close with these small words. But still there are a few days left, so we will try our best to get more information through our committee before the government approves it as much as possible. And if unfortunately the original text of the agreement is received only after the conclusion of the agreement, we will continue to open all the discussions in the progress of ratification by the National Assembly of Korea and our civil society organizations. And thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me to this precious discussion. And I will follow this conversation later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that was really a good rounding up of all the different perspectives, because one of the most challenging things and most criticized is the lack of transparency to even parliamentarians, let alone to the public. And in the end, these agreements, by their very broad scope, will require many laws and regulations and guidelines and practices, not just laws, but practices down to the administrative level to be changed. And so how can we do that without actually having a broader discussion, and very importantly from the parliamentarians who are responsible for making the laws as well. So thank you so much. And I think it's very interesting to hear from you also that Korea has this act which tries to provide the standard operating procedure, the SOP for negotiations. And I think many countries have actually have those discussions also. I think that's really important because the nature of these negotiations are very, very different. I think many of us were at civil society, and there was a big campaign because in the TPP, the Obama administration actually required secrecy as part of the condition. And secrecy even restricted to the actual individual officials who were negotiating. So even other people in the same ministry had no access. And I think that's something that we cannot accept. And we want to help our government, come to good agreements, and transparency and discussion and assessment and good research is really what's needed. So I want to thank all our speakers and the panelists, because I think we've got such a rich amount of research experiences and ideas on how to move forward. If as a political issue, the signing is going to go ahead, we know, of course, that in the end, the entry into force will have to be ratification by every country. It is regretful that the text is not available before signing. I think the TPP was in the past available before signing. So we will only see it after it's signed. But then, then we are talking about doing a lot of work after many, many years. I'm sure many of our negotiators also work very hard to try and get the best for their country. But as our discussion showed, there are many issues about ASEAN regional cooperation, East Asia, cooperation, which may not really be helped by these agreements. Yeah. So anyway, we have actually 2 more minutes, but we have booked this Zoom space for another half an hour. So for those of you who want to stay on and share your ideas, ask questions of our panelists, and Rashmi, who's still with us here, you're more than welcome to. So those of you who do want to stay on, we can extend by at least another 15 minutes, but we do have another half an hour available to us. Right, so so please, I think we have had a lot of sharing of information and links to documents and all that in the chat. But if anybody has any questions or just comments to share your experiences, please do put up your hand or just unmute yourself, or we can unmute you. I think early on, and I apologize, Mr. Jayabalan had raised his hand in the first round, but I didn't manage to see it. So if he's still with us and would like to make a comment or ask a question, please, you are most welcome to do so. Yeah, I think Mr. Jayabalan is here. I see him. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. So this is very access to medicine, you see. Mm-hmm. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please.
Access to medicine is an important issue, and especially where it concerns generics. See, the generic manufacturing, many of these countries, the burgeoning is burgeoning in the sense that it's really, take countries like even Malaysia, the generic market is improving tremendously. But by the same token, so is in Bangladesh, so is it in many of these countries. But the problem is the issue will come to when it comes to generic manufacturing and generic production. Then once you sign to RCEP, now how will it impact on this issue of generic manufacturing? And I think anytime a country signs these things, now you're going to really restrict access to medicine, because generics are the way forward to make sure access to medicine is a right. So this is what I wanted to get a comment from any of these speakers.
Yeah, any speakers or anybody in the audience who work on this issue? Well, maybe just to quickly touch on this, Dr. Jayabalan, as I think many speakers have pointed out, unlike, for example, the TPP or the CPTPP, some of the really horrible, worse than WTO kind of extension of intellectual property monopoly, those provisions that we find in the CPTPP, they were actually not included in the RCEP intellectual property chapter, right? That has a lot to do with health ministries themselves, who were very against the CPTPP provisions. They were quite vocal. We also had huge campaigns from consumer groups, patient groups, health groups, unions in the public sector, etc. So there was such a lot of pushback that we don't have those obvious, what we call the WTO TRIPS Plus provisions in the IP chapter. However, there are provisions in the IP chapter related to enforcement, which are more than what is required to be put in place by the WTO TRIPS agreement. Yeah. So, for example, I mean, depending on your national law, your patent law, for example, may be much more pro pharmaceutical MNCs and not so pro generic in the country. If that's the case, and the generic company is found to have so-called infringed a patent of a big pharmaceutical company, then the enforcement provision of RCEP is worrisome. Because, for example, it says that the compensation that has to be paid by the generic company, if found to be infringing the patent, will have to be set at a retail price. So this is, we're talking about, you must well close your business. You know, that's something that we don't see, all right, anywhere before. So that kind of thing in the agreement is very dangerous. And if in the COVID situation, it's not just about the intellectual property chapter. There are all these other chapters that relate to whether you will have the freedom, depending on whether each country negotiated its own exclusion from the rules of RCEP. We don't know because we haven't seen it. There are rules around export restrictions, rules around, let's say, you know, buy local first so that we can boost our local industry. There are rules, for example, in the investment chapter that doesn't allow parties to the RCEP to require that foreign investors have to put certain positions in senior management and the board for the nationals of the country. That's how we want to get more, you know, high level, so senior management posts to the local people. There is a prohibition in that, in these trade agreements. So, for example, in Malaysia, we have recently seen an announcement from our government that all expatriate hiring will have to first go through any organization, foreign or local. You want to hire an expat, you must first offer to the job to a local, find a local, advertise it. If you can't, then only you give to an expat, right? So is this actually going to be in violation of RCEP? We need to study to look at what each of our countries have agreed or not agreed to do, right? Whether we've saved the right to actually require that. So employment, boosting local industry, there are many chapters, not just the IP chapter, that we will need to study to see whether it's going to be good or bad for our local industry. So I think that I hope gives some indication on what we need to look at, Dr. Jayabalan. So it's not just medicines, right? It's also masks and you know, PPE, or making ventilators, valves. You know, in Italy, it was so classic because trade secret and patents made it so difficult. It's not difficult to make it technically, but because of intellectual property in the first wave in Europe, it was impossible to get either very expensive or there was shortage. So an Italian company actually managed to make these valves at, like, you know, $1 or $2 when it's $1,000 in the patented project, a protected product. And that itself just shows you how absurd it is. And then that company, the local company that did through 3D printing, was actually threatened with an infringement of intellectual property case, right? So we will see these kind of issues coming up more and more. And that's why we need to really have much more careful rethinking and reviewing before governments even sign, let alone ratify. Okay, so I'll stop at that. And this is something that I think we will be doing more work on, all of us collectively. Okay, and I think Sanya has just posted something on the chat. So if you want to look at more impact, there's a link there to look at some of the proposals in the lead chapter that explains a bit more what I just said. Okay, right, is there, I think there is a question. Is there another question? Autumn Solace. Autumn Solace, yes, please, you can unmute and speak. Is Autumn Solace there? You raise your hand, you can. Not there anymore. Oh, yes, please unmute yourself and make a comment or ask a question.
Hello, are you listening to me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed. Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, thank you. I'm Oton Solis from Costa Rica. I have been in the policy-making side of things, and we went through in the Central American region through the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the USA. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the issues that has been raised there were issues of concern. And I want to be short and say that here in the region, income distribution have deteriorated because, as some of your panelists were saying, governments lose policy tools, and a lot of room is given to multinational corporations, and tax revenues have fallen. Now, a few of our countries are facing difficult fiscal situations, and there is little room for using some of the tools of tax collection in order to fix that issue. So I just advise, my intervention was to advise some of the people interested in these trade agreements to look at what has happened in the region. We have been now 12 years with CAFTA, and the promise of development is not there. Nothing to do with the pandemic. Before that, the situation was very tough. And congratulations for the panel, and thank you for allowing us, people at the other side of the world, to listen to the most interesting presentations. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for joining us from the really far part of the planet, and thank you for sharing your experience. In fact, Mrs. Solis, if there are papers written up or some assessment of the number of years of having the CAFTA and what it has done to the region, it will be really useful. Even if it's in Spanish, we'll get it. It will be really helpful. I think this is something that I think we need to learn from. So thank you so much for joining us and being with us. You can definitely, if you leave your contact details with us, we will be very happy. I think you have registered, so we do have your contact. So we'll be in touch.
Yes, you do.
Thank you so much for sharing the experience. And I think one of the things that we do believe very strongly in, all the organizers of this discussion, is not just regional, but South-South. We have a lot to learn and also to share and to benefit each other. And the South-South collaboration, which UNCTAD actually was very strong in some years ago, is where we like to revive that cooperation, because these North-South agreements are very, very unequal and exploitative. So thank you very much again. So I have another person, Maru Tayan, sorry for mispronouncing, Mr. Maru or Ms. Maru Tanayagam, please. You can unmute and speak.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am Mardhanayagam from South India, Tamil Nadu. Now the pandemic times, very, very critical position in India. So the unorganized women workers are very dangerous in Tamil Nadu. What are the future? I don't know. Please answer. Okay.
Yes.
Aryan.
You're talking.
Our organization name is Needs Foundation.
Needs. Oh yes, that's right. So you're working with women.
Yeah, women sector, unorganized women sector. We are working with unorganized women sector, particularly construction and mill workers and domestic workers.
Yes, and
yes.
Yeah,
now we are very, very affected in the pandemic time.
Yeah, we can imagine.
Now the Tamil Nadu government, they start thinking the school, and today they opening the cinema theater also. A very dangerous thing now, I think.
Yes, you have raised very important. Like many of the workers in the informal sector, those who are marginalized, are suffering most, and a lot of the a lot of measures have a lot of impact. So where's the social protection? I think this is what many of our groups here are also trying to work on. Yeah. So we wish you all the best. Thank you so much for joining us. And that's why we want to make sure that we don't have new problems of agreements that may not help people like those you are helping and working with.
Women, children also.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
And good luck.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Beverly, I think you have a question on whether every country needs to sign for the treaty to be accepted. I think Sonia is in the process of answering this question. It'll be typed into the answer. Yeah, we'll type it in for you. Okay. I mean, to become legally enforceable, a treaty needs a certain number of ratifications. So each treaty will have its own rules. So the signing is the first step to conclude, but it comes into force only when a certain number of countries have done the next legal step called ratification. I'm not quite sure what the requirement is in RCEP, but you don't need all countries to sign in some cases. So it depends on what the treaty provides for. And then it comes into force, but it comes into force for the country only when that country ratifies it. Yeah, the whole treaty will come into force when the certain number of countries have ratified, and that depends on what is provided for in the treaty. So I think Sanya is going to answer this question in writing, Beverly. Okay. All right. Do we have others who would like to share some thoughts, or any of our panelists, or Rashmi, if she's still here, if you'd like to have any final words? We have a few minutes more. Yes,
Oh,
Rashmi.
I just want to thank the organizers. I think it has been a very important discussion, and anyone wants to get in touch with me to have details, product level, country level details, I can always share the results of the study. And this paper hopefully will be, it's a forthcoming paper publication. And in the end, I would just like to, reiterate that it is very important for governments to retain and preserve their policy space and physical space, especially in these RTAs. Otherwise, some of the studies show a lot of GDP gains, but you have to really look closely at the assumptions. You slightly change the assumptions and the results will change accordingly. So if you do a literature review, you will find many studies using CG model, but with different assumptions. They use the same data, same model, but different assumptions, they come up with different results. So we need to be careful about these studies. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the reminder, Rashmi, and also to let others know, especially those I think who may be listening in from different governments in the region, that of course UNCTAD has always been really helpful on request. Will also come in to do some specific studies, sectors or for the country, and also not just in this area. I think the work around the digitalization, e-commerce, tax, those are areas that Rashmi herself and UNCTAD has been really helpful on as we navigate those areas. So thank you very much, Rashmi. We will be hounding you, and we look forward to the paper that you'll be publishing. Yeah, I think that yeah, there are lots of exchange of links and information. So please keep an eye on the chat box and save the chat box. Also, you are following the discussion. Does anybody else have any last comments or thoughts they want to share?
You're clean.
Yes.
Can I just,
yeah.
sorry, it's Kate.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say two things. One was about the policy space. I forgot to mention that whilst some governments are claiming that the RCEP has retained policy space particularly in relation to public services, history shows us that those provisions are not successful within the WTO and elsewhere. That these kind of provisions that carve out, policy space supposedly to regulate for public interest or public services have not been defendable when they've come to either state or investor state. So that's one thing. The other thing I just wanted to mention was, around the question around pharmaceuticals, and I think you answered quite a bit, but I just wanted to point out that really, whilst there's been a lot of work on medicines in particular, what the pandemic has shown us is that countries need the capacity to produce a range of inputs, but also services for public, for public health crises. Right now, we've heard today that there's a potential vaccine. That vaccine will come with its own complications. For example, it will require refrigeration at a level that we've not experienced before. So that's a new level. When you think about the 7 billion people on the planet that need this, we don't currently have a vaccine delivery service. We don't have the workers, but nor do we have the infrastructure to deliver something that would require that level of refrigeration. Now, refrigeration's not protected. Like when you think about the kind of inputs that governments need, it's not only medicines, and it's also regulations and the standards. So we didn't have the face masks available, or the PPE, or the protection that workers needed, but we also needed strong regulation around the standards that we wanted for workers. And that's another area that governments are giving up, is the sort of regulatory capacity that they might have in relation to occupational health and safety. So yeah, these are just a couple of additional things I think that this pandemic has shown us.
Yeah. No, thank you for pointing out, Kate. And also, I think Sania has actually pointed us to a paper that looks at because there's a lot of false comfort, and really we can't fault some of our negotiators, because those who are negotiating, if you look at the wording, right? For example, there's a health exception, but if you really look at where the health exception language is coming from, it was really cut and paste from the WTO agreement, right? And then in the WTO, where those cases state to state, in 44 cases where governments have actually used the health exception to justify why they were doing certain things, certain measures, only one out of those 44 attempts was successfully defended in the WTO, and that was the asbestos case. So the other 43 cases, you know, in the WTO system, dispute system found that it was not justified as a health exception. So there is really, in a way, some level of false comfort when we think that we have got enough exceptions and safeguards. And then you have to see, for example, in the CPTPP, the health exception does not apply to the investment and intellectual property chapters. So then we have to look across, you know, what the devil is always in the details. So this is why I think many people have pointed out why we need to have a really good understanding of the whole agreement, how different chapters, more than 5, 6, 7, 8 chapters will affect health alone. In TPP, it was more than 10 chapters that affected health. From procurement to intellectual property, which got a lot of attention, but not services, you name it, it's all interrelated. And of course, we have many of our governments have also tried to carve out, you know, this and that, but this carving up means we are giving up a lot and trying to save something. And the pandemic, I think everyone has been emphasizing in this discussion today, the pandemic shows us we need absolute policy space, and we need it also for our development, as Rashmi keeps reminding us. Yeah, so I think that we are quite clear why we do not want to head towards, and where we want to head towards will agreements like RCEP help us or constrain us, and that is the real assessment that needs to be done before governments take the next step. So do we have a lot more information being shared? Any more comments? Any last words? If not, we are 5:20 almost, and we have patiently still have 83 participants with us, which is great, and we have more than 110, so, and including from as far away as Central America. I think somebody was from El Salvador who also actually made a comment, so we're very, very glad that these are not just regional, these are actually common problems that all of us and challenges that we all face, and we want to learn from each other. Okay, I think I don't see any more hands or comments. Right, so just remind those who are interested that tomorrow there will be the trade union press conference related to RCEP and COVID. And we at our end, in TWN, will also share with those who are interested the work around measuring and assessing COVID measures to see whether they could be in violation. And I think it's not just RCEP, many of our governments already are parties to other agreements, investment and trade agreements, and even WTO agreements have to be really relooked in the light of the challenges over the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps, which will be very, very disruptive, as Jomo said right at the beginning. And in the disruption, we have to be very creative, we have to be very protective in the best sense of the word. And this is something that we need to do collectively as citizens, and also with our government, including, very importantly, the parliamentarians. So it is nothing more. I would once again, on behalf of all the of APWLD and all the collaborating organizations that have come together to put this together, and I want to thank particularly Hien, who did a lot of work to just put everything together, to our speakers and our panelists who have just given us such a strong voice from the ground, from research, from analysis, and this gives us a lot of hope that together we can all help each other to navigate these very difficult times that we are in. And those who are working on the ground, as our friend from Tamil Nadu just now shared with us, the reality is a very painful one, and lots of people are suffering as we speak. So we really need to think of these agreements as not just something on a piece of paper, but that it impacts on lives, and we have a great responsibility as a collective. So thank you so much to all of you again, and we will follow up to see how we can work more together on this very important and other issues. So goodbye, everybody. Maybe the panelists can all put on their camera so we can have a little snapshot of the team, if somebody can do it. Rajita or Hian, can you take a picture of the panelists? Okay.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much, Jocelyn, and also special thanks to the panelists and all the participants today. So please stay on and keep your smile so I can take the screenshot. Okay, and I think some other, please, if you are willing to open your camera, Ian.
Ian may have gone to save the textile industry of Indonesia. Yeah. Well, thank you to all the participants, and I think there are quite a number of people also from the policy side, maybe even some negotiators. We invited them. We hope they were able to join us. So let's see how we can all work together. And all the best to Ms. Zhang when you go and fight in the Korean General Assembly. And Barry, we look forward to the report that your advisory board is coming out with on Trade for All that you had mentioned in your intervention. Yeah.
It's reported, and I put the report URL in the chat. So we have yet to see the government kind of taking action on everything, but they've said they will accept the recommendations broadly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rashmi. Fantastic work. All the best.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye. Bye, everybody.